In this fourth and last lecture on climate change, in the third week of our module on sustainable energy, we talk about emissions accounting and how different countries and how we compare emissions from different sources, and specifically what emissions intensity means. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, developed guidelines in 1995, which were revised once or twice since then, to calculate national emissions accounts. And the purpose of that was to standardize the methodology of emissions calculations across all countries, because when we're setting targets, it's important, first of all, to set a consistent baseline for every country, to understand a baseline, and also to measure progress in a consistent, accurate, comparable, and transferable manner. So when we're talking about making national level statistics, all of those factors are important. And the guidelines show three different approaches that we can make. These are three tiers of emissions accounting methodologies. They increase in accuracy, but they also increase in complexity and data requirements. So that means they decrease in feasibility. So the first tier is the most basic, maybe the least accurate, but also the most feasible, so to standardize accounts across every country. So in tier 1, there's a standard emission factor of different fuels applied to every country based on the carbon content of the fuels, because we know what a lump of coal, we know what a litre of oil or a metre cube of gas, we know the actual chemical components of that fuel, and we can, with basic chemistry, know what the combustion causes in terms of CO2. Tier 2 then can add country or technology specific emission factors, because different fuels across different countries might have different emission factors, because there might be more or less carbon in the fuel, and different technologies as well might produce CO2 in different ways. Tier 3 then might have even more detail at the country level and even at the plant level, so down to the individual power plant might have specific emission factors. But in this lecture we'll go through very basic tier 1 emissions accounting and give an example for Ireland. So what's included? Burning of fossil fuels is included. The burning of biomass emissions are not included. Why is that? It's because biomass is part of this natural carbon cycle. So if biomass is combusted in a sustainable way, and that means that if you basically burn down a tree, that the tree is allowed to regrow in some normal time frame. That means that no additional CO2 is added to the atmosphere, because that carbon which you released had previously come from the atmosphere extracted through photosynthesis. That's in contrast to fossil fuels, where that carbon is locked deep down inside the ground and it's released. It would otherwise not have been released without human activities. If biomass is used sustainably, no additional CO2 is considered to be emitted to the atmosphere. But if biomass is burned unsustainably, so that there is forest loss, or there's a loss in the stock of carbon in forestry or in the biomass, or as a result of, say, land use change, then emissions are accounted not for in energy, but in this other category called agriculture, forestry, and other land use, AFOLU. So the basics of computation of CO2 in this tier 1 emissions methodology, it's very simple. So for every fuel product, every fossil fuel product, down to different types of coal, different types of oil product, and different peat and natural gas products, and for every economic sector, we multiply the amount of quantity by this product specific emission factor. And an emission factor is simply the emissions per unit of fuel quantity. We know the fuel quantity from the energy balance of a country. So every country gathers statistics on how much energy by what fuel is consumed in different sectors. And we use this standard emission factor for each fuel. And then we sum across all products and sectors. That can be completed in two ways. First of all, it can be completed based on the supply of fuels to a country. So if we know how much, say, coal Ireland is importing every year, we know how much is in store, we can say, well, we just assume that that's burnt. Or else it can be on the consumption in every sector. So if we say we know how much petrol is sold in the forecourts, and that's burned obviously, or we know how much kerosene is sold to houses as home heating oil, so we can compute that in two different ways. There's some important principles that are applied to every country. So first of all, countries calculate emissions based on the territorial principle. The territorial principle means that emissions are accounted for in the place where they're burned, not necessarily in the place where the product is used. So for example, if Ireland generates excess electricity. We have an interconnector with the UK, and we export, say, 10% of our electricity to UK. The emissions from that electricity are accounted for in Ireland because the combustion, the fossil fuels were burned in Ireland to create that. On the other hand, if the UK is in the North Sea, drills a lot of natural gas, exports it to Ireland, emissions are also accounted for in Ireland because it's in Ireland where the natural gas is combusted. Similarly, emissions related to producing goods for export are accounted for in the country of the production, not the consumption. So likewise, when Ireland imports, let's say, heavy steel for construction, it imports lots of plastic stuff from China. It imports cars from, say, Germany or the Czech Republic. All of the emissions that went into producing those goods abroad are accounted for in the country of production. And you might argue that we should be responsible for the emissions in our country, and that's true, but practically and politically it's very, very hard to account for emissions at the point of consumption rather than the point of production. But some countries still track their what's called consumption level emissions, like in the UK. A third point there is that international aviation and shipping emissions, they're not allocated to any particular country. So in the kind of global emissions accounts, there's a separate category of international aviation and shipping, and there's separate targets for those sectors, which the shipping companies and aviation companies promise to adhere to. The reason for that, again, is because it's very hard to allocate emissions to every country. So if I'm flying to, say, Hong Kong via London and I don't know, or some other intermediate countries, it's very hard to measure, who I am, where the emissions should be accounted for, and so on. And the computation of other greenhouse gases then, other than CO2, as we know from the previous lectures, greenhouse gases trap heat at different rates, and this global warming potential metric, GWP, is used to compare the effects using CO2 as a benchmark. So usually we use GWP 100, and that means the warming impact over 100 years, because as you remember, the warming impact of, say, methane, which is a short-lived but much more potent greenhouse gas, would be much higher, measured at a 20-year level, and much lower at a 100-year level. So we call that CO2 equivalent. So the GWP 100 of methane is 25. These are the three most significant greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And these are the GWP 100 factors for those. So if we have 1,000 tons of methane, that's equal to 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. That should be, there's some missing there, that should be CO2 equivalent. And that's the standard unit of reference, CO2 equivalent. And then this, I'll take you through the slightly complicated table. This is a very simple and aggregate way of calculating Ireland's emissions accounts from what we know in the energy balance about our fossil fuel consumption and from the methane in agriculture. It doesn't take into account nitrous oxide and other ways. So it's a lot more complex than this. And my colleagues at the EPA and SEAI will say that this is a huge simplification of the hard work that they do. But I think it illustrates how you can calculate national level emissions. So we know from energy balance, from energy statistics, which in Ireland is generated by the SEAI, which is based in the statistics unit is based in Cork. We know that in 2018 there was about 7 million tons of oil equivalent of oil, about 4.5 million tons of oil equivalent in gas, 700,000 tons of oil equivalent of coal, and about 700 tons of oil equivalent. 700,000 tons of oil equivalent of peat. We know from the IPCC what the average emission factor for these fuels are, and SEAI also provides those. So we can measure that in kilotons, a little bit, kilotons of CO2 per kiloton of oil equivalent. So that's the same as tons per ton of oil. So you might ask, why is the emission factor of oil 3 tons of CO2 for every ton of oil burned? And actually the standard, say if you heat your home with kerosene, the standard tank is 1,000 liters, which is about 800 and something kilograms. So it's nearly a ton of oil that you would be burning if you burned a full tank of home heating oil, you would release nearly 3 tons of CO2 with that. That's because basically in the process of combusting a fossil fuel, the carbon atom mixes or reacts with oxygen in the atmosphere, so the carbon turns into C and 2 O's, and basically the extra weight comes from the 2 oxygen atoms. So there's a difference between the weight of carbon and carbon dioxide, somewhat confusingly. But you can see here that this is called the emission factor. It can also be called the emissions intensity of different fuels. So the highest emission factor for the fossil fuels is peat, that followed by coal, followed by oil, and then gas. So basically you multiply if you get the units in the right way, you multiply the annual consumption by the emissions intensity and you get the emissions in kilotons of CO2. So that's about 21 million tons of CO2 from oil, about 10 from gas, about 3 from coal, and about 3 and a bit from peat. Add those all together, 38,000, so that's 38,000, which is 38 million tons of CO2 from fossil fuels in Ireland. Now we'll just compare that to the calculation from methane. And I'm not a methane person, an agriculture person, but there are standard ways of calculating the amount of methane from cows at the farm level from belches and from manure. And that's estimated for 2018 by the EPA, from the Environmental Protection Agency, at about 460,000 tons of CH4 of methane. You have to multiply that by the GWP 100 by 25, so you get about 11.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent of methane. So basically measured over their heating impact over 100 years, which is how we do that in the standard way. We have about 38 million tons of CO2 and 11.5 million tons from methane. That number would change if we changed the sort of the time frame that we're measuring warming over. And just for context, in 2018, the full emissions of greenhouse gas, which includes, say, methane from waste, and nitrous oxide, the third most significant greenhouse gas, which comes from over application of fertilizer, by the way, is an extra 10 or so million tons of CO2. So we emit about 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent, according to this GWP 100 metric. Other emissions intensities then, very briefly, and as I mentioned before, an emission intensity is just the amount of emissions per unit of activity, and I'll give you a few different examples of emissions intensities. Here is the grams of CO2 per kilometre. So again, a unit of emission per activity, the activity of cars is per kilometre. So the emissions intensity, the carbon intensity of new cars is decreasing, but that has flattened off. Finally, then, the emissions intensity of electricity is very significant, and the emissions intensity of electricity depends on the share of high carbon fuels, for example, peat, coal, or even oil, to low carbon fuels, and also the efficiency of generation. And I'll show you here this electricity map, which shows the emissions intensity live of different fuels. So here is this website, electricitymap.org, and it shows the emissions intensity of electricity generation in different countries. So here, for example, we can click on Ireland, and we can see here that live, based on the current mixture of fuels going into the electricity system, each kilowatt hour of electricity burned produces about 450 grams of CO2. A kilowatt hour, remember, is maybe a kettle on for 1 hour, so that's about half a kilo of CO2. And why is that the case? So right now I'm looking outside. It's a nice sunny day in Ireland, but there's no wind for once. And so there's there's very little low carbon electricity on in the mix at the moment. Here there's a little bit of hydro, and some electricity coming from our hydro storage as well. So hydro, that's Ardnacrusha and so on, these dams that produce electricity. But most of our electricity at the moment is coming from gas, which has a carbon intensity of 490 grams per kilowatt hour. Oil, surprisingly, that doesn't often come on. I'm surprised. which has a carbon intensity of 650 grams, and then coal. So remember that Money Point is back online, so 820 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Then wind is very, very little. So wind has a very low carbon intensity. So that's Ireland. We can take a look at a few of our neighbouring countries here. We can zoom in and see that the kind of darker the colour, the more carbon intensive. So here Poland has a very high carbon intensity. It always has because it has huge reserves of coal, so 630. It does have some low carbon renewables. It is got burning some biomass at the moment. It also has solar and a bit of wind happening. If we look at Germany, Germany has gone through a huge revolution. It has a lot more solar and wind than other countries, but it also has coal. So it's been shutting down its nuclear fleet. So low carbon there includes nuclear. Renewable there doesn't include nuclear. And you can see that gas is also part of the mix there. Let's look at one of the very sort of low carbon intensity countries. Here, Sweden and a lot of the Nordics, they have huge hydro reserves and also obviously wind and some of them water as well. So at the moment, Sweden is running mainly on hydro from rivers. It also has a significant nuclear fleet and some wind. Iceland then has geothermal, which is electricity generated from heat underneath the Earth's surface, and hydro as well. So basically, the lower carbon countries are ones that have either built up a lot of nuclear or have significant renewable reserves. If we look at Spain here, it's interesting. Obviously, it's sunny in Spain at the moment. A lot of solar, but also some gas, some wind, and some nuclear. So that's why Spain is quite low intensity. We can look around. Here, some of the most obviously this map doesn't have data for every country in the world. This is India here, and different regions in India have very, very high carbon intensity, and that's because they're completely run on coal. And that's a huge concern because India has a very quickly growing electricity demand, and also a young coal fleet. So those coal power stations that have been built will be around for another few decades at least. Here's Australia, again, huge reserves of coal, a little bit of gas there. Other regions in Australia have more gas and a little bit of wind, but coal is huge in Australia. New Zealand, huge hydro reserves. Geothermal in the North Island, some gas. We can go to Asia. Let's see what China is running. Oh, this is Russia. And then different states in North America vary very much by their resources. These are different grids. So North America has different grids. So every grid sort of has one specific emissions intensity. Here, Ontario and Yukon have very high nuclear and renewables reserves.